Margaret Lane tried to burn the last thing her husband ever touched, a rosary charred black from the fire that took his life. But as the flames rose, the air grew cold, the light shifted, and a shape began to form in the fire. What she saw next would silence even the priest who came to bless the house. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and how old are you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the moment it began. The last of the light had already drained from the sky when the clock in the hallway struck 6, and in that small farmhouse on the edge of Maple Hollow Road, the sound seemed louder than it had any right to be. The house had always creaked and sighed in winter, but now each noise felt sharper, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, the November wind moved through the trees in long, uneven gusts, brushing the branches against the tin roof like a slow hand dragging across metal. The fields beyond the porch had turned the color of old ash, and the ground carried the soft scent of damp leaves and distant smoke. Inside, Margaret Lane sat near the window with the curtains half drawn, her hands folded tightly around a mug she hadn't lifted in 20 minutes. The tea had gone cold. She didn't notice. The house still carried traces of another presence. His boots lined neatly by the back door, his old station jacket hanging on the wall, the faint smell of soap and smoke that had belonged to him and still clung to the hall when the air turned dry. She had told herself she would clear it all away after the funeral, but 2 months had passed and she hadn't touched a thing. Her husband Daniel Lane had died on Route 28, an explosion, they said, when a leaking gas line ignited during a rescue. The report from the county fire department arrived a week later in an envelope stamped "Fatal Incident Summary." She had opened it once, read the line that said "thermal trauma with cardiac arrest," and then folded it back into the drawer. The words were clean, almost polite. They said nothing of what it was like to identify a body whose face she could not touch, or how his hand that once fixed engines and built fences and carved the wooden rosary he carried to every call, was returned to her wrapped in gauze. She had stopped going to church after that. The first Sunday she stayed home, she told herself she was too tired. The second Sunday she told herself she would go next week. By the third she stopped pretending. When Father Allen knocked at her door, she kept the chain latched and spoke through the small gap. He said her name softly, told her the parish missed her voice in the choir. She nodded without answering, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. When he finally left, the silence he left behind was heavier than his visit. In the living room above the mantel, there was a clean rectangle on the wall where the crucifix had hung for 30 years. It was one of the first things she and Daniel had placed there after buying the house. Taking it down had been harder than she'd expected. She'd wrapped it in newspaper and put it in the bottom drawer with the rest of the things she couldn't throw away, but couldn't look at either. Candles, prayer cards, a small statue of Saint Florian that Daniel used to keep in his locker. The space where the cross had been caught the morning light differently now, pale against the smoke-stained paint like the ghost of something once steady. She moved through her days by pattern rather than purpose. Wake at dawn, open the blinds halfway, make coffee she rarely finished, read no mail, and sit through most of the afternoon without turning on the television. Sometimes she would walk to the end of the gravel drive just to see if the mailbox flag had been moved, even though no one wrote anymore. Even the dog from next door, who used to wait at her gate, had stopped coming by. That night, the 43rd after Daniel's death, she decided to clean the storage room. It wasn't a decision made with thought, it was more like the body trying to fill silence with movement. The bulb in the ceiling flickered when she switched it on. Dust hung in the air like fog, and cardboard boxes leaned against one another in uneven towers. One box was marked in faded marker, "Daniel, station gear." She pulled it forward, coughing at the burst of dust that rose from the lid. Inside were folded uniforms still faintly carrying the smell of smoke and detergent, a cracked helmet visor, and a flashlight that no longer worked. At the bottom lay a sealed plastic envelope with a typed label, "Property of Station 4, Personal Effects." She stared at it for a long time before touching it. The plastic was cool, wrinkled at the edges, and inside she could make out something dark and thin, coiled loosely like a cord. She carried it to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened the flap. The object slid out into her hand, a rosary, half burned, half whole. The upper section of beads was smooth and untouched, each one shining faintly under the lamp. The lower half was blackened, the wood brittle and scarred, and the crucifix twisted at an angle as if it had melted and cooled too quickly. It felt heavier than it should have. She remembered seeing him hold it on nights when the siren went off, his thumb moving across the beads in quick, silent rhythm. He had carved it himself years ago from a piece of oak he found after a barn fire. Margaret turned it over and over, the motion mechanical. There was no reason it should have survived the explosion at all, yet here it was, half destroyed, half preserved. It reminded her too much of what had come back to her from the wreckage. She set it on the table beside the envelope, stood, and turned off the lamp. The house seemed to shrink around her in the darkness. The only light came from a small night lamp near the hallway, glowing pale yellow against the wall. It caught the edge of the rosary's metal crucifix, making it glint faintly in the dimness. She sat down again, this time by the fireplace, though she didn't light it. The iron grate was clean. She had scrubbed it more than once since the night of the accident. Not because it needed it, but because it was something she could control. She boiled water for tea but forgot to drink it. When she finally poured it into the sink, the steam fogged her glasses. The sound of running water filled the silence for a few seconds and then stopped abruptly. She wiped her hands on a towel and looked back toward the living room. The rosary still lay there, the faint gleam of its metal catching the glow from the hallway light. It looked out of place now, a relic of something that no longer fit in her world. The clock ticked steadily, the refrigerator hummed once and went silent again. Somewhere outside, a car passed down the county road, its headlights cutting briefly across the curtains before vanishing. Margaret lowered herself onto the couch and folded her arms around herself, more from habit than cold. Her eyes fell to the space on the wall where the crucifix used to hang, that pale outline that seemed to absorb what little light was left. She sat like that for a long time, motionless, the minutes indistinguishable from one another. The rosary, the badge, the lamp's faint glow, they stayed just as they were, small islands of stillness in a room that no longer had a pulse. And as the hours moved on and the wind pressed harder against the glass, she remained awake, staring at nothing, unable to say whether the silence was comfort or punishment, only that it had become the only thing she could still recognize. The first snow came without warning that winter, drifting down in heavy snowflakes that seemed too large for the air to hold. Margaret had not checked the forecast, and by late afternoon the road outside was already white, the fields erased under an unbroken sheet of powder. The farmhouse felt smaller in the dim blue light that filtered through the curtains, and every surface carried a faint chill, the kind that clings to glass, to porcelain, to skin. She moved through the rooms with her arms folded, not out of fear of the cold, but because it steadied her. The furnace had been unreliable all week, growing and fading, so she had stopped expecting it to keep up. But what happened that night would turn the quiet into something else entirely. At dusk, she stacked 3 logs in the fireplace and struck a match. The sound was sharp and brief, a spark in the silence, and the flame rose eagerly, bending toward her hand as though it recognized her. She added kindling, then watched until the fire settled into its rhythm. Slow, pulsing, the wood cracking at its own pace. She stood there longer than she meant to, her palms stretched to the warmth, her reflection faintly visible in the blackened glass of the hearth. The scent of the smoke mingled with the dry wood and something faintly metallic from the iron grate. She had been cleaning earlier, moving things she didn't want to touch but couldn't throw away. In the corner of the living room sat a small box of Daniel's things she had already gone through but somehow couldn't put back. She opened it again without thinking, her breath fogging in the cold air, and inside found his old notebook, the one he used to carry in his jacket pocket. The leather was cracked from heat and time. She flipped through the pages, notes, reminders, dates of drills and volunteer calls. The final line, written in his familiar block letters, stopped her. Carry the rosary. Nothing else. Just those 3 words. She stared at the ink until the lines blurred. The fire behind her popped suddenly, making her flinch. The draft rattled the windows. She reached for the mantle, steadying herself, then noticed the rosary lying there, where she had left it weeks ago. It looked smaller now, less like a relic, more like an accusation. She picked it up and felt the weight of it in her hand. The uneven texture of the half-burned beads, smooth at first, then rough and brittle where fire had touched them. The crucifix was cold and slightly bent. Her voice sounded strange when she spoke. "You didn't protect him," she said quietly, the words trembling between anger and disbelief. "All those years, all those prayers, what for?" The fire crackled as if answering. She took a step closer, the heat pressing against her face, and tightened her fingers around the beads. And then, without another word, she threw it into the fire. The beads hit the embers with a dry, hollow sound. For a few moments, everything looked ordinary. The fire swallowing what it was given, the logs hissing softly, smoke curling upward in thin streams. But then the flames began to change. The orange deepened into a color she had never seen in fire, a dense electric blue that pulsed like breath. The air shifted. The sound of crackling wood ceased altogether, leaving only the faint hum of wind against the chimney. The curtains stirred inward. Though the windows were closed, Margaret stepped back, shielding her eyes. The light from the fire grew too bright to look at directly, spreading across the walls like water. The air smelled suddenly of roses, clean, sharp, unmistakable. It didn't make sense, but she knew the scent. It was the one he used to bring home from the garden every spring, a scent she hadn't smelled since his death. She pressed her hand to her mouth, the heat from the hearth wrapping around her like a living thing. No one could have imagined what she saw next. Inside the heart of the flame, something was moving. Not smoke, not light, but shape. It shifted slowly, pulling itself into form, until the blur became a face, faint at first and then certain. Daniel. His features were soft, calm, illuminated from within as if light were rising through him, rather than upon him. His eyes were open, not pleading, not afraid, only fixed on hers. Behind him, in the trembling brightness, another outline began to take shape. Tall, veiled, and indistinct, yet wholly present. The edges of it shimmering as though woven from the air itself. Margaret's body went still. She felt every heartbeat echo in her chest, the pulse visible at her throat. She whispered his name once, barely audible. The figure didn't move, but something, a warmth, a pressure, a gravity Swafford's situate, seemed to reach out from the fire toward her. She couldn't tell if the light was growing brighter or if the room around her was fading. Her eyes watered from the intensity, and when she blinked, she thought she saw the veiled figure turn slightly, its face lifting toward her. No words, no sound, just that silent movement. And then it was gone. The blue light collapsed into darkness so suddenly that she gasped. The fire went out, completely, not dimmed or dying, but extinguished, as though the air had been pulled from the room. The silence that followed was deeper than anything she had ever heard. She stepped forward, trembling, and crouched by the hearth. The ashes were cool, no smoke rose. The smell of roses still filled the air, layered over the faint scent of burnt wood. She reached into the hearth with both hands, sifting through the ashes carefully. When her fingers brushed metal, she froze. There, lying on top of the gray powder, was the rosary, whole, untouched, even clean. The crucifix glinted faintly in the half-light, unburned. She lifted it gently. It was cool, smooth, and dry. She turned it over in her palm, tracing the tiny grooves with her thumb, unable to understand what she was feeling. Fear, grief, or something entirely different. The wind outside howled again, bending the trees against the walls. She sat down on the floor, still holding the rosary, and wrapped it carefully in a white handkerchief from her pocket. Her breath came slow, uneven. She leaned back against the couch and stared at the dark fireplace. The only sound left in the house was the steady ticking of the wall clock, each second louder than the last, marking the exact minute the fire had died. But what had died and what had returned, she could no longer say. The scent of roses lingered long after the draft had settled. The flame's afterglow seemed to hang in the air, invisible yet perceptible, like warmth without source. Margaret's hand still trembled slightly, but her face was calm, almost blank, as though her body had run out of ways to react. She looked toward the window. The snow was falling harder now, flakes swirling in the faint light outside. For a moment she thought she saw movement beyond the glass, a figure passing. But when she looked again, there was only her reflection, pale and motionless, holding something white against her chest. She did not move for a long time. The lamp near the hallway flickered once, and the silence folded over itself, deeper than before, as if the house had chosen to listen. Somewhere inside that stillness, the faintest trace of warmth touched her face again. Not from the hearth, not from the air, just enough to make her turn her head slightly, as though she were being called by name. The house had fallen into that deep, late-night quiet where even the wind seemed to move carefully, brushing only the corners of the window panes. Margaret hadn't gone to bed. She sat where she had been for hours, the small lamp beside her breathing out its weak, yellow light, the teacup still untouched on the table beside the folded badge and the half-burned rosary. Her eyes were open but unfocused, following nothing in particular. The air smelled faintly of iron and dust, the way it sometimes did just before snow. It was sometime after midnight when the furnace coughed once, tried to start, and failed. The sound broke the stillness. She rose slowly, pressing her hands to her knees to push herself up, and felt the cold already seeping from the floorboards through her socks. She wrapped her sweater tighter, listening to the ticking of the thermostat that no longer controlled anything. When she touched the radiator, it was lifeless. The room had begun to cool quickly. She crossed to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, flakes were falling. Not many, not yet, but thick and steady, silver under the porch light. The empty fields glowed faintly white, and the road beyond the gate was already disappearing. She stood there for a while, her reflection layered faintly over the dark glass, her face pale, the faint outline of the rosary's crucifix glinting behind her on the table. But what happened next would draw her from stillness into something she would never again describe in words. She turned back toward the fireplace, hesitated, then knelt and set 3 logs across the grate, arranging them with the precision she didn't notice in herself until later. The cold made her breath visible, curling upward like faint smoke. She struck a match, held it to the kindling, and watched as the flame grew in small, patient bursts. It was the first sound of warmth in weeks, the crackle of sap, the low sigh of wood catching. The fire brightened the room in uneven pulses, painting her shadow across the far wall. The heat spread slowly, softening the ache in her hands. She sat back on her heels, letting her body thaw. And in that wavering light she saw, almost hidden behind a stack of books on the mantel, the small wooden box she had opened once and promised herself she wouldn't open again. She reached for it anyway. Inside were fragments of her husband's life compressed into things. A flashlight, a folded note from the station, a key chain she'd given him for his birthday. And beneath those, the notebook. The cover had darkened over the years to a deep brown, the edges worn, the stitching loose. She opened it carefully. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and soap. She turned through the scroll lists, numbers, supply logs, partial prayers written in shorthand, until she reached the final page. 3 words, all in capital letters, each pressed into the paper as though written with force. Carry the rosary. Her breath caught in her throat. She closed the notebook and set it beside her, fingers resting on the cover for a long moment. The fire popped, sending a spark upward that disappeared before it reached the flue. The scent of wood smoke deepened. She looked toward the mantel again. The rosary was there, lying in the same place she had left it that night, half in shadow, the light catching on the blackened beads like oil on water. Her voice came out low, almost hoarse. "You carried it," she said, and then louder, "and it didn't save you." The sound of her own words startled her, harsh, too alive in the room. She looked at the rosary as if it might answer, but it only shone faintly in the light. She stepped closer, heat from the fire reaching her face, her heartbeat visible in her throat. "You prayed," she whispered, "and it burned with you." She reached out, grabbed it, felt the uneven surface of the beads, some smooth, some sharp. The crucifix was cool, its bent metal pressing into her palm. For a moment she almost dropped it, then tightened her fist instead. She stared at the fire, its orange core flickering like breath, and said quietly, "If he took you, then I'm done asking him for anything." She opened her hand and threw the rosary into the flames. For several seconds, nothing happened. The rosary hit the logs, bounced once, and lay still among the embers. The fire hissed softly as the beads began to heat. Then, without warning, the light changed. The orange deepened into blue and the flames grew higher, spreading outward in a single smooth surge that reached past the edges of the hearth. The temperature in the room rose suddenly. The curtains trembled, though the windows were closed. Margaret stumbled back, shielding her eyes from the brightness. The sound of crackling stopped. The fire no longer looked like fire. It was a column of moving light, solid and fluid all at once, and in the air there came another scent, roses, unmistakable, strong enough to mask the smoke. Her eyes watered from the brightness. She blinked hard, trying to understand what she was seeing. And then she saw it. Within the light, shapes began to form, faint and shifting. First a blur, then something human, a face emerging from the motion. Daniel. His eyes open, his mouth still, a look of peace she had never seen in life. Behind him something taller, drape, the suggestion of a veil and hands folded in stillness. The heat pressed against her skin like sunlight. Though she stood several feet away, her knees weakened, she caught the edge of the mantle to keep from falling. No one could have imagined what appeared in that silence. The air pulsed once, soundless but heavy. The blue light flickered, bending toward her, and then, as suddenly as it had come, it vanished. The fire was gone. The wood lay black and cold, the room dim again, the scent of roses lingering faintly in the air. She lowered her hands slowly, her breathing shallow. The chill returned so quickly it made her shiver. She crouched near the hearth, still afraid to touch what remained. There was no smoke, no heat, only ashes spread evenly across the grate. Something glinted among them. She leaned closer, brushed the ashes aside, and froze. The rosary lay there, whole, clean, as if untouched. The beads shone faintly, and the metal crucifix reflected the weak light from the lamp across the room. She reached out and lifted it. It was cool against her fingers, smooth, unburned. Her voice came out in a whisper. "No," she said once, but it wasn't disbelief. It was something quieter, something she couldn't name. She wrapped the rosary in a white handkerchief and held it to her chest. The scent of roses still lingered in the air, softer now, mixing with the old smell of smoke and wood. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily. She sat back against the couch, the rosary in her hands, eyes fixed on the dark hearth. The house around her seemed to breathe. The faint crack of settling wood, the whisper of wind at the door, and beneath it all, that almost inaudible hum left behind by the fire, as if the air itself still remembered the light. And somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, she thought she heard her name. Not spoken loudly, not even clearly, but there, a single word moving through the silence like breath across glass. She looked toward the window, but there was only the reflection of her own face, pale and still, holding something that should have been destroyed and wasn't. ChatGPT Skazal. Morning came gently, as if the light itself understood that the house had endured something fragile. In the night, a pale gold seeped through the curtains, soft and slow, catching the dust in the air like small drifting embers that refused to settle. Margaret had not slept. She was still sitting in the same place, a blanket pulled around her shoulders, her hands resting in her lap with the rosary folded carefully between them. The fire was gone, only a faint line of ash at the edge of the grate. But the scent of roses lingered faintly, clean and unmistakable, as if it had been woven into the wood itself. The furnace had come back to life sometime before dawn, its steady hum filling the silence with a rhythm that felt almost kind. She rose stiffly and opened the curtains. Outside, the world was white. Snow lay smooth across the yard and over the fence posts, untouched and glowing under the first sunlight. The trees shimmered with frost, and the air beyond the glass seemed so still it could have been holding its breath. She watched for a while, her reflection pale in the window, and then turned toward the mantel. The handkerchief lay there, folded exactly where she had placed it. She lifted it again, unwrapped it, and for the first time saw that the crucifix had somehow straightened itself. The bend that had twisted the metal was gone. She touched it with the tip of her finger, half afraid it might change again if she blinked. Later that morning she called Father Allen. Her voice was calm, even steady, and when he asked if everything was all right, she said only that she would like to bring something to the church. He told her to come by after 10. By the time she set out, the snow had stopped and the narrow road through town glistened with thawing ice. The sun caught on the telephone wires, turning them into thin silver lines that followed her all the way to St. Joseph's. The church door was open and the smell of wax and pine polish drifted through the foyer. She stepped inside, her boots squeaking softly against the tile. And for the first time in months, she didn't hesitate before walking down the center aisle. Father Allen was preparing for Mass, arranging the vessels on the altar. He looked up when he heard her, and his expression softened. She held the rosary in both hands as she approached, the light from the stained glass washing over her face and shifting colors. She said almost in a whisper, "It didn't burn." The priest paused, then nodded slowly, motioning for her to sit in the front pew. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he took the rosary gently from her hands, examined it under the light, and then said quietly, "Would you like to keep it here for a while?" She nodded. The Mass that followed was small, mostly the same familiar faces, but the air felt different that morning. There was a kind of hush over the congregation, not heavy but attentive, as if everyone could sense something just beneath the surface of the ordinary. When the organ began, the sound filled the nave softly, wrapping around the wooden beams like breath. Margaret closed her eyes. She hadn't intended to pray, but the words found her anyway. Not memorized, not perfect, but simple and full. When she opened her eyes again, the morning light had shifted. It poured through the high window above the altar, bright and almost golden, and in that moment, a faint scent of roses passed through the air once more. But what happened in that quiet minute would be remembered long after Mass had ended. A young parishioner sitting near the back lifted her phone to take a picture of the sanctuary, and in that single frame, the light captured something no one else saw at the time. A soft, blue shape suspended above the altar as though the air itself had formed a veil. The girl gasped, and a few nearby turned, but by the time anyone else looked, the light had already faded. The priest continued, calm and steady, and the moment passed like a breath between two words. When the service ended, Father Allen showed the photograph to Margaret in the sacristy. She looked at it for a long while, saying nothing. The shape was faint but clear, hovering above her own head as she knelt, her hands clasped, eyes closed. It didn't frighten her. She simply whispered, "Don't share it," and he nodded. The image was stored quietly with the parish records, without announcement, without explanation. That evening, the snow melted in slow rivulets down the gutters, and the light outside turned the color of copper. Margaret sat by the fire, a real one, small and steady, the rosary now hanging from a hook beside the framed wedding photo on the mantel. The air in the room was warm and still. She let her hands rest in her lap and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not joy exactly, not even peace, but a sense of being carried, as if some invisible weight had shifted away from her shoulders. The clock in the hall ticked, its sound gentle again, ordinary and alike. She thought of Daniel then, not as he had died, but as he had lived, with the quiet steadiness of a man who believed in fixing what was broken, even when he didn't know how. She understood now that maybe faith worked like that too, not as something that protects us from loss, but something that remains when all else is gone. The last thread holding when the world falls apart. Sometimes the smallest signs are the ones that stay with us. She thought, the scent of roses in a cold room, a light that lingers longer than it should, a fire that burns without harm. They don't ask to be proven, they only ask to be noticed. Lord, for those who walk in grief and cannot yet see the morning, send them warmth and gentle light. For every heart that has grown cold from loss, breathe new life and courage within it. Teach us to trust what we cannot explain, to see your hand in the quiet places, and to remember that no flame of love ever truly dies. Grant us peace enough to forgive the past, faith enough to face the unknown, and grace enough to recognize your presence when it comes softly, like dawn after a long night. Amen. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on those who have carried you through your darkest seasons. Share their names or your own story of light and renewal in the comments. Let others know that faith still breathes in quiet rooms, and miracles still visit those who wait with open hearts. And if someone you love needs to remember that, share this story with them tonight. Thank you for watching. God bless you. Sometimes the holiest moments are the ones no one else sees. A single candle burning in silence and a soul quietly remembering that love never leaves. Let us pray for those who still seek light in their darkest moments, for the ones who have lost their way in grief, and for those who no longer know how to speak to heaven.